The ox was limping when Abigail Gentry reached the gate, and the sun had already bled itself dry across the western horizon, leaving nothing behind but a bruised purple sky and the faint howling of something distant and hungry in the hills. She had been walking since before noon, her boots worn through at the left heel, the sole flapping with every step like a tired tongue. Behind her, the single ox, a broad-shouldered beast named Solomon that her late husband Thomas had purchased 3 years prior with money. They did not have dragged a wagon that listed to one side because the rear axle had cracked somewhere back near the Dry Creek crossing. Atop the wagon and clinging to its sides were her 4 children. Eli, who was 9 and had his father's stubborn jaw. Clara, who was 7 and had not stopped asking questions since sunrise. Twins Benny and Rose, who were 5 years old and had fallen asleep tangled together like a pair of young foxes in the back corner of the wagon bed, their small chests rising and falling in the particular peace that only young children can manage when the world around them is coming apart. Abigail was 31 years old. She had not slept a full night in 6 weeks, not since the fever had taken Thomas in the space of 4 terrible days, and she had spent the months since then trying to hold together what little he had left behind. What he had left behind was not much. A modest homestead in Caldwell County, Texas, burdened by debt to a man named Harlan Voss, who owned most of the land and water rights in a 30-mile radius, and who had come calling with 2 hired men, and a legal document 3 weeks after Thomas was in the ground. She had signed the paper because she had no choice, and because she did not understand the full weight of what she was signing, and by the time she did understand, Harlan Voss had already sold her homestead to someone else and given her 14 days to clear off. She had packed everything that mattered into the wagon. It was not a great deal. Some quilts, a cast iron skillet, a Bible with Thomas's name written in the front cover in his careful handwriting, a box of seed corn, 3 changes of clothes for each child, and a small tin box that held $11.40, which was every cent she had in the world. She was headed for her cousin Martha's place in Laredo, a distance she estimated at somewhere near 200 miles based on directions she had gotten from a man at a crossroads store 3 days back. She did not have a proper map. She had directions scratched on the back of a flour sack. The man at the crossroads store had told her to follow the river road south until she hit a settlement called Harrow Creek, and from there take the eastern fork down past the Shepherd Spread, and then continue straight another 40 miles to the Laredo Road. She had found the eastern fork. She had found the bend in the road where the man said she would see a fence line running for half a mile. She had followed that fence line until she reached a gate, and that was where Solomon had stopped walking, not because she asked him to, but because his front right leg had been favoring since late afternoon and had finally decided it would carry him no further. The gate was made of good timber, solid and square, which was more than could be said for most of what she had passed in the last 3 days. On the fence post to the right, burned into the wood with a careful hand, were 2 words, Shepherd Ranch. She stood at the gate with one hand on Solomon's neck, and the other pressed flat against the fence post, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Eli climbed down from the wagon and stood beside her without being asked. That was the kind of boy he was. He read the sign on the post and looked up at her. "Is this the place?" he said. "It is the place that is in front of us," she said, because that was the only honest answer she had. The lane beyond the gate was maybe a 1/4 mile long, leading toward a cluster of buildings she could just make out in the dying light. There was a main house, low and solid, with lamplight in one window. There was a large barn, newly built from the look of the pale lumber. There were 2 smaller outbuildings and what looked like a stable. In the near pasture, half a dozen horses stood motionless like dark monuments. Abigail Gentry had been raised to handle herself. Her own father had been a hard man from a hard stretch of western Tennessee, and he had taught her that asking for help was a thing you only did when there was no other road left to walk. She had reached the end of the road. She unlatched the gate herself, because there was nobody else to do it, and she led Solomon forward one slow step at a time, talking to him soft and steady the way you talk to something that is hurting. Perry Shepard was in the process of shutting the barn doors for the night when he heard the gate. He had spent a long day on the north fence line, replacing posts that a spring flood had pulled loose and rerouting a section of wire that had gotten tangled with a deadfall cedar. He was 34 years old, lean and rope-hardened, with hands that bore the particular calluses of a man who worked without gloves more often than with them, and a face that the sun and wind had marked with the kind of lines that looked like they belonged there. He had owned the Shepard Ranch for 7 years, having purchased it with the money his father left him, and the wages he had saved from 4 years of cattle driving up the Kishom Trail in the early 1870s. He ran 200 head of cattle, employed one full-time ranch hand named Dooley McCabe, and kept to himself in a way that the people in Harrow Creek had largely accepted as just the manner of the man. He was not unfriendly. He was simply private in the way that some men become private after a certain amount of life. There had been a woman once, a schoolteacher named Florence, who had come out from San Antonio with plans and brightness, and who had left 2 years later when the loneliness of the ranch had worn through her like water through limestone. He had not blamed her. He had just gotten quieter after that, and tended his cattle and his land and let the years accumulate. He heard the gate and looked up. The light was almost entirely gone from the sky. He could see a shape moving up the lane, something slow and halting, and it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. A woman, leading an ox that was walking wrong, a wagon behind them that sat crooked, and children. He could count at least 2 visible at the sides of the wagon, and as he looked harder he thought he could make out more shapes in the bed. He set down the bucket he was carrying and walked to meet her. They stopped maybe 10 feet apart. He could see her clearly now in the last of the light. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pulled back under a bonnet that had seen better days, and a face that was composed in a way that told him she was holding herself together by main force of will. Her dress was road-dusty and her boots were nearly ruined, but she looked at him straight on without flinching, and that told him something important about her character. "I am sorry to arrive at this hour," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. "My ox has gone lame on the front right. My axle is cracked. I have 4 children. I mean to reach Laredo, but I cannot make it tonight, and I am asking if I might rest my animal and my children on your property until morning." Perry looked at the ox. Even in the dim light he could see the swelling in the foreleg. He looked at the wagon axle. He looked at the children at the sides of the wagon, 2 small ones in the bed who were barely stirring, and a boy on the ground and a girl peering down at him with frank dark eyes. "Name's Perry Shepard," he said. "This is my ranch." "Abigail Gentry," she said. "Late of Caldwell County." He nodded slowly. He was not a man who made noise when silence would do. He walked to Solomon and crouched down to examine the foreleg, running his fingers along the bone and feeling the heat of the inflammation. "He has not broken it," Perry said, straightening up. "But he has strained the tendon badly. He needs rest, cold poultices, and grain, not in that order." "I have grain for him in the wagon," she said. "I have grain in the barn." He said it simply, not as an offer that required debate. "Bring him in. There is a stall." Abigail Gentry looked at him for a moment, and he thought he saw something shift behind her eyes, some small fracture in the careful composure, like the surface of a frozen pond when the temperature rises. She pressed her lips together, and then she said, "Thank you." And he heard clearly what was underneath those 2 words, the depth of exhaustion and relief that she was not willing to show any more fully than that. He led them to the barn. He opened the wide doors and lit the lantern inside and showed her the stall he had put fresh straw in just that morning. He took Solomon's lead rope himself and guided the ox in, and the animal went without argument, which told Perry that it was truly done for the night. He began working the harness loose while Abigail helped the children down from the wagon. The boy Eli, he heard her call him, was steady and quiet and immediately useful. handing down a bundled quilt to his mother without being asked. The girl Clara asked Perry 3 questions in rapid succession about the barn, the horses in the stall across the way, and whether he had any cats, and he answered all 3 in order because it seemed like the right thing to do. He did have cats, as it happened, 2 of them, a gray one called Dusk, and an orange one that he had never gotten around to naming properly, and so just called Orange. Clara declared that she would look for them in the morning. The twins, Benny and Rose, were half asleep and pliant, and Abigail carried one and Eli half carried the other, and they were settled into a corner of the clean straw with quilts around them before Perry had finished seeing to Solomon. It was only then, with the children settled and the ox drinking slowly from the water bucket he had brought, that he turned to look at Abigail directly again. She was standing in the middle of the barn with her arms at her sides and her eyes moving over the space with the careful assessment of a woman taking inventory. He saw her note the clean straw, the solid walls, the good lantern light. He saw her note that the place was well kept and that there were no whiskey bottles or other signs of the kind of man she might need to worry about. He did not take offense at the looking. He would have done the same. "The house has a spare room," he said. "It has 2 beds in it. The children would be more comfortable." She looked at him steadily. "We are fine in the barn." "I am not disputing that you are capable of being fine in the barn," he said, choosing his words with the same care he gave to everything he did. "I am telling you there is a room with beds in it, and that you and your children are welcome to use it. I will sleep here tonight and keep an eye on that ox's tendon." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was carrying the smell of rain coming from the northwest. Solomon shifted in the stall and made a low sound. "You do not need to sleep in your own barn on our account," she said. "The ox will need the poultice changed in the night," he said, which was true, and which also conveniently made the arrangement about the animal rather than about charity, which seemed like the version of the truth she might be able to accept. She accepted it. She woke Clara and Eli enough to walk them to the house and carried Rose, and Perry carried Benny, and neither of them said anything about the fact that a stranger was carrying one of her children across his dark yard in the middle of the night in the Texas wind. He showed her the spare room and where the water pitcher was, and where the outhouse was, and left her to it, and he went back to the barn. He did not sleep much. He sat on a hay bale with his back against the barn wall, and listened to the rain come in just after midnight and beat against the roof. And he thought about the woman and her 4 children and her lame ox and her cracked wagon axle. And he thought about where she was going and what she was going toward. And he thought about the particular geometry of a life that could be reduced to $11.40, and a flour sack with directions on it, and 1 ox that had given out. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and replaced the poultice on Solomon's leg. Around 3, he took inventory of the wagon in the barn light. The axle was cracked but not fully broken. He had a spare axle in the back of the equipment shed that was close to the right size. With half a day's work, he could fit it well enough to hold for 200 miles of Texas road. He looked at the wagon wheels and saw that 2 of them needed the iron rims reset, but that could be done in a morning at his small forge if he worked fast. Around 4 in the morning, 2 hours before dawn, he lit the forge. He worked through the darkness, steady and methodical, the way he worked at everything. He reset the iron rims on both wheels. He fitted the spare axle and cut it true with his saw and fitted the coupling properly, and tested the alignment by feel and lantern light. He packed fresh axle grease into the hubs. He checked all 4 wheel spokes and found only 2 that were questionable, and replaced them with stock from his lumber pile. By the time the sky in the east had gone from black to the deep indigo blue that comes about 40 minutes before actual sunrise, the wagon was sound. He did not wake her to show her. He fed Solomon a good measure of grain and replaced the poultice again, and covered the ox with a burlap blanket against the damp, and then sat back down on his hay bale and let himself be still. He was not sure what he was thinking. He was not, he knew, the kind of man who had practiced the art of thinking about why he did things. He did what was right because it was right, and he did not require a great deal of deliberation to know what right was. A woman alone with 4 children and a lame ox had appeared at his gate at dusk. The correct response was obvious, but there was something else, some small persistent thread that he could not quite identify, that had to do with the way she had looked at him straight on when she arrived, with the way she had thanked him as if the 2 words were the surface of something much deeper and wider, with the way she had carried Rose across the dark yard without any fuss or drama, just doing what needed doing, the way that people do when they have been doing what needs doing for a long time without expecting anyone to notice. He noticed. The sun rose over the eastern hills and found Perry Shepard sitting in his own barn in his work clothes with axle grease on his hands and hay in his hair, and he was not bothered by any of it. Abigail was up with the sun, as she always was. She had slept in 4-hour blocks, waking twice to check the children, and she felt as rested as she had felt in weeks, which was not fully rested but was something. She helped the children dress and she washed their faces with water from the pitcher, and she braided Clara's hair because Clara would not let her leave the bedroom without it, and then she walked them through the main room of the house toward the door. She noticed the house as she passed through it. She had not paid much attention the night before, too tired and too focused on getting the children settled. Now she saw it properly. It was a man's house in the way that a man's house can be perfectly functional and yet somehow incomplete, not dirty but austere, without the small layering of a domestic life. No curtains on the windows, no rug on the main room floor, a single shelf of books above the fireplace, a good solid table with 4 chairs. She noted the books. She had not expected books. She found Perry in the barn, already up and moving, and she found the wagon and stopped. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at the wagon for a long moment. She had not yet met Eli's eyes because she did not want him to see what was happening in her face. She walked to the wagon and put her hand on the new axle and ran her palm along the reset wheel rim and looked at the packed hubs, and then she turned around. Perry was standing by Solomon's stall with a coffee cup, watching her with the same direct, quiet manner he had shown the night before. He was not demonstrating what he had done. He was just standing there drinking his coffee. "You did this in the night," she said. "In the early morning," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at the axle again and then back at him. "Mr. Shepard, I cannot pay you for this. I did not ask to be paid. The materials alone, I had them," he said. "They were sitting in the equipment shed. They are of more use to you than they were to me sitting there." Abigail Gentry had been thanked many times in her life, and had thanked many people in her life, and she understood the usual grammar of the exchange. What she was not accustomed to was gratitude that felt like it might actually overflow the banks of her ordinary capacity to contain it. She put one hand on the wagon side and focused on that for a moment, and when she turned back, she was composed again. "How is Solomon?" she said. "Better than last night," Perry said. "The swelling is down. He should rest another day before you put him back to work. The tendon will not hold if you push him too soon." "I cannot stay another day," she said. She stopped. She had what? She had a cousin in Laredo who was expecting her in 2 weeks who had no idea what had happened to Thomas or to the homestead. She had $11.40 and 4 children, and she was sitting at a stranger's ranch in the Texas hills. She was not sure she could articulate what the urgency was precisely, except that it had been driving her for weeks, this forward motion, this momentum that felt like the only thing standing between her and the dark, still water of despair. "You can stay another day," Perry said. Not unkindly, but with the simple certainty of a man who has seen what she was carrying and has done the arithmetic. "Your ox cannot travel. Your children ate nothing since I do not know when. There is breakfast on the stove." She opened her mouth. "I already ate," he said, preempting whatever she was going to say about being a burden because he could see it coming. "Duly ate. There is extra. It will go to the dogs otherwise." There was no dog in evidence. Eli, who had been standing quietly beside her, looked up at his mother with an expression that communicated his own opinion on the matter without any words at all. Clara was already heading toward the house. Rose and Benny were watching from the wagon with the particular focused attention of very hungry small children. Abigail Gentry made a sound that might have been a laugh, brief and caught before it could fully form, and then she went inside to feed her children. Dooley McCabe was 42 years old, Irish-born, and had the weathered good humor of a man who had survived enough hard years to appreciate the soft ones. He had been working for Perry Shepard for 4 years and had a general opinion of his employer that could be summarized as follows. Finest man he had ever worked for, stubborn as a January post, worked himself half to death, and entirely too alone for someone who had that much worth giving to the world. Dooley took one look at the woman eating breakfast at the table with her 4 children, and then looked at Perry standing in the kitchen doorway, drinking his second cup of coffee with what Dooley classified as the particular brand of careful not looking that means you are actually looking very hard, and he decided that he would make himself extremely useful around the property for the foreseeable future and stay entirely out of whatever this was going to be. He did not say any of this out loud. He just ate his second breakfast at the bench outside and whistled to himself. The day that followed had its own natural rhythm. Perry tended his cattle in the morning as he always did, riding the south pasture and checking on the herd while Dooley worked the horses. Abigail stayed near the barn, watching Solomon, and she put her hands to work the way she always did when she was not moving, mending the children's clothes, working a loose wheel spoke that had escaped Perry's notice, repairing the wagon's canvas cover where it had pulled away from the frame rod. Eli helped her without being asked, and Clara organized the contents of the wagon into some scheme she had devised, and Benny and Rose ran between the barn and the house until they found the cats, at which point they sat down in a patch of sunlight and did not move for an hour. Perry came back at midday, and they ate the meal that Abigail had made from what she had found in his kitchen, and from the dried beans and cornmeal she carried in her own supplies. And they ate at the table outside because the day had turned warm and bright after the rain, and Perry watched the children eat with the focused attention of a man who does not usually have children at his table and finds the experience of unusual interest. Clara asked him directly, as was her way, why he lived alone on a big ranch. He did not appear to be disturbed by the question. He considered it. "Someone has to," he said. Clara considered this at length and then said that she thought it must be very quiet, and Perry said that it was, and that he was accustomed to it, and Clara said she thought she would not like it, and Perry said that was probably because she was the kind of person who made noise wherever she went, and Clara thought about whether this was an insult or a compliment and decided it was a compliment, and that she liked Mr. Shepard very much. Abigail watched this exchange from across the table. Perry caught her eye once briefly, and she looked away. Not from discomfort, but from the particular kind of self-consciousness that comes from being watched while you are watching something that matters to you. In the afternoon, she walked to the fence line with Eli, who was curious about the cattle, and Perry came alongside them because he was going that way. He showed Eli how to read the condition of cattle at a distance, how to look at posture and movement and coat, and Eli asked serious questions, and Perry answered them with the same seriousness he brought to all things, and Abigail walked beside them and listened and felt something she could not quite name, something that was not quite peace and not quite longing, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "My husband worked land," she said, when there was a natural pause. She was not sure why she said it. Perhaps because she wanted Perry Shepard to know that she was not ignorant of this kind of life, that she was not a woman from a town who had no concept of what the work of a ranch meant. "What kind of land?" Perry said. "Cotton mainly, some corn. It was a modest operation." She paused. "It is gone now. The land was mortgaged, and I did not understand the full terms of it until after Thomas passed, and by then there was a man named Harlan Voss standing in my yard with a document and 2 men behind him who were not there to have a conversation." She said it plainly, without bitterness, just the facts. Perry was quiet for a moment. "Voss," he said. "I know that name. He has been buying up land along the river road for 3 years. He is effective at it," Abigail said. "He is ruthless at it," Perry said, and there was a low edge in his voice that she had not heard before. "He has done the same thing to 4 families in this county that I know of. Waits for a man to die or a crop to fail and then arrives with papers." "That was the shape of it," Abigail said. Perry looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she saw in his face not pity but something harder and cleaner than pity, something that looked like anger on her behalf, and that was, she realized, considerably more useful to her than pity. Eli had run ahead to look at the cattle through the fence, and neither of them followed him immediately, and for a moment they stood side by side in the warm afternoon looking at the south pasture, and the hills beyond it, and the sky that had gone the deep clear blue that comes after rain. "How far behind is your cousin expecting you?" Perry said. "She is not expecting me at any particular time," Abigail said. "She knows I am coming, but not exactly when." He nodded. He was quiet in the way he was quiet, which was not uncomfortable, not the quiet of a man who had nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who was thinking before he spoke, which she had come to recognize as his way. "Your ox should rest 2 days," he said, "not 1. If you push him on 1 day's rest, you risk losing him entirely on the road, and then you have no ox at all and a full wagon and 4 children." She knew he was right. Solomon's tendon was better than last night, but it was not right, and she knew the difference because she knew that ox and had worked beside him for 3 years. 2 days, then, she said. She said it simply, and she did not apologize for it, and Perry gave one brief nod and walked on to catch up with Eli, and Abigail stood there a moment longer in the afternoon light before she followed. That evening she cooked supper in Perry's kitchen, properly this time, with time to do it right, and the smell of cornbread and beans and the salt pork she found in his larder filled the house in a way that seemed to change it somehow. Perry stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he washed up for supper, and she noticed the way he stood there, the particular stillness of a man who has walked into a room and found something in it that was not there before. She did not comment on it. She stirred the pot and called for the children and poured water into the cups and set the table, and they all sat down together. And it was a loud meal because Clara and Eli were full of the day's events, and Benny had apparently made friends with the unnamed orange cat and was reporting on this friendship at length. And Perry listened to all of it with that steady, careful attention he gave to everything. After the children were put to bed, Abigail sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, and Perry sat in the chair at the end of the porch with his own cup, and the night came in around them, carrying the smell of the damp grass and the cedar and the particular clean sweetness of the hill country night. "Were you always here?" she said. "On this land?" "No," he said. "I came from Gonzales County. My father had land there. He died when I was 26 and left me a portion of the money from the sale of it. I drove cattle for 3 years after that, up the Kishom Trail mostly, saved what I earned, found this piece of ground in '72 and bought it." "You built all of it yourself?" "Dooley helped," he said. "The barn is the newest. Finished it last spring." She looked at the barn in the dark, its solid black shape against the lighter dark of the sky. She thought about him finishing it last spring, not knowing then that in the fall a woman would arrive at his gate at dusk with a lame ox and 4 children and a cracked wagon axle, and need exactly the space that he had just built. She did not say this out loud. It was too much to say out loud to a man she had known for less than 24 hours. "What will you do in Laredo?" he said. "My cousin Martha has a house," Abigail said. "Her husband died 3 years ago. She has taken in boarders, and she has said for some time that she has need of help running the house. She has no children of her own. I thought it might suit us all for a time until I can find a way to provide for the children independently." "That is a practical arrangement," he said. "It is the only arrangement I have," she said honestly. He was quiet. She could hear the cattle moving in the south pasture, the low sounds they made at night, and somewhere far away there was a mockingbird still going, which was late for a mockingbird. "You are a capable woman," he said. He said it the same way he said everything, directly and without ornament, as a plain statement of fact. She was quiet for a moment because something about the way he said it, without condescension and without excessive admiration, just as an observation of what was true, moved her in a way she was not prepared for. "I try to be," she said. "From what I have seen," he said, "you more than try." She looked at him in the dark. He was looking out at the pasture, not at her, and she was grateful for that because she was not sure what was on her face at that moment. "Good night, Mr. Shepard," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Gentry," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a long time after that. The second day passed in much the same rhythm as the first, but with the ease of people who were no longer strangers. In the morning, Eli asked Perry if he could help with the cattle, and Perry said he could, and the two of them rode out together, Perry on his good roan horse and Eli on the gentle old mare. He kept for light work, and Eli came back at midday so proud and so tired that he ate half his dinner and fell asleep at the table, and Perry carried him inside without a word, which Abigail did not watch because watching it was more than she could manage at present. Clara found a nest of barn kittens behind the grain bin that Perry had not known about, which led to a significant reorganization of priorities for the entire afternoon. Rose and Benny were utterly devoted to the kittens and could not be moved from the barn with anything short of the promise of sugar, which Perry produced from a tin in his kitchen, with the air of a man who had forgotten he had it. Abigail watched him give her twins each a small twist of hard candy, and recognized the look on his face, the slightly surprised expression of someone who has discovered that small children can be genuinely good company. In the afternoon, she and Perry worked on the wagon cover together, because the frame had two broken rods that she had not gotten to yet, and he had the spare steel rod to make it right. They worked side by side at the barn workbench, and the conversation came naturally, and without the careful navigation of strangers, moving through the country they had both known, the years and the people and the peculiarities of the land. He had traveled far in his cattle-driving years, as far north as Kansas, and she had always lived in Texas, but had read as widely as she could get books, and the conversation moved through these things with an ease that surprised them both. At some point she was holding the end of the rod steady while he drove the mounting bolt home with a hammer, and her hand was 6 inches from his hand, and they were both aware of this in a way that neither of them acknowledged. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead," he said, not stopping his work. "Why are you not married?" she said. She said it the way she said most things, directly, because she was not a woman who orbited questions she actually wanted answered. He was quiet for a moment. He put the hammer down and tested the rod fitting. "There was a woman," he said, "Florence. She came out from San Antonio 7 or 8 years ago. She was a school teacher. We were together for 2 years. He was quiet again. She found the ranch too isolated. She went back to the city. Did you ask her to stay?" "I asked her once," he said. "She had already decided by then. I did not ask twice because I thought if she needed me to ask twice, then what we had was not what I thought it was." Abigail considered this. "That is a very proud position," she said. He looked at her, a little startled by the directness of it. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "But I understand it." He looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "Thomas and I never had to ask each other twice for the important things," she said. "I think I know what you mean." She was quiet. "I think it is also possible to be too proud to see when someone is frightened rather than decided." He was very still for a moment. Then he picked up the hammer again. "That may be true," he said. They worked in silence for a while, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who have just exchanged something real. That evening Abigail told the children about leaving in the morning, and Clara cried, not dramatically but genuinely, the quiet tears of a child who has found something good and does not want to leave it. And Abigail held her and let her cry and did not tell her it was fine because it was not entirely fine, and Clara was smart enough to know the difference. Rose and Benny wanted to know if they could take a kitten. Perry, who was in the doorway, said that he could spare a kitten. Abigail looked at him. He shrugged, the first time she had seen him do anything that was less than fully deliberate. The mother has 8, she will not miss one. Rose and Benny looked at their mother with an intensity that rivaled anything in their small emotional repertoire. Abigail looked at Perry. He was carefully looking at the wall. "A kitten," she said. "One." The twins debated who the kitten belonged to for approximately 30 seconds, before deciding it belonged to both of them, and naming it immediately. They named it Perry, without any apparent awareness of the situation this created. Perry looked at Abigail, and Abigail pressed her lips together very firmly. "I am honored," he said gravely, and that broke whatever she was holding back, and she laughed. A real laugh, the first full one he had heard from her, and the sound of it did something definitive to the inside of his chest. The morning of departure had its own kind of weight. The sky was clear and pale, and the dew was still on the grass when Perry brought Solomon out of the stall. The ox moved better, not perfectly, but without the severe favoring of 2 days ago, the tendon having had the rest it needed. Perry had wrapped it cleanly that morning and advised her to keep it wrapped for the first week. The wagon was sound. The wheels were true. He had packed additional grain for Solomon in a burlap sack and placed it in the wagon bed. He had also placed a small crate with a selection of supplies: salt, dried beans, coffee, cornmeal in the front of the wagon bed, and when she found it and turned to object, he said, 2 days of food for 200 miles in case you run short, and his tone invited no argument. She did not argue. He helped load the children's things. Eli shook his hand with the seriousness of a boy who is trying very hard to be a man, and Perry shook it back with equal seriousness. Clara hugged him without warning, a sudden fierce hug around the middle, and stepped back with the dignity of someone who has made a decision and does not regret it. Rose and Benny said goodbye to the cats, and then to Perry, and then to the cats again. And then it was just Abigail and Perry standing at the head of the lane, and the sun was fully up now, burning the dew off the grass, and Solomon was looking ahead in the resigned, patient way of an animal that has accepted its role in the world. She stood in front of him, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she had not seen him do before, and she thought that this might be the most honest thing about him that she had seen, this small, involuntary sign of something more than he was presenting. "I do not know how to thank you for this," she said. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I am going to anyway," she said. She took a breath. "You repaired my wagon in the night. You rested my ox. You fed my children and gave us your spare room and gave my son a horse to ride and gave my daughters a kitten. And you did not once make me feel like a charity case, which is—" She stopped. She pressed her fingers together at her side. "That is a rare thing, Mr. Shepard, and I want you to know that I know it." He was very quiet for a moment. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see it clearly, the lines of it, the steadiness of it, and the particular expression it was wearing now, which was the expression of a man who is holding something with great care. "Safe travels, Mrs. Gentry," he said. She nodded and climbed up to the wagon seat and picked up the reins and clicked to Solomon, and the wagon moved forward, slow and steady, and she did not look back, because if she looked back she was going to have to reckon with something she was not ready to reckon with on the side of a morning road in Texas with 4 children aboard and 200 miles ahead of her. Eli looked back. Perry was standing at the end of his lane with his hat still in his hand, watching them go. Eli did not say anything about this to his mother for 3 days. The road to Laredo was long and not easy, but the wagon held. Solomon walked well on the wrapped tendon, and Abigail was careful with him, resting him at midday and checking the wrap each morning and evening. The children, fortified by 2 days of good food and rest, were in better spirits, and the small kitten named Perry traveled in the front of the wagon in a box with hay, and created what could generously be called an ongoing adventure as it repeatedly escaped and had to be recaptured. They made it to Laredo in 10 days. Martha was a small, bustling woman of 38 with a house that smelled of beeswax and good cooking, and she came down her porch steps at a near run when she saw Abigail and stopped and put both hands on Abigail's face and looked at her for a long moment before she said anything. "You look like you have walked through fire," Martha said. "That is close enough to accurate," Abigail said. Martha took them all in immediately and thoroughly, assigning beds and meals and washing with an efficiency that was both impressive and slightly overwhelming. The children adored her at once. Rose and Benny followed her like ducklings, and she did not appear to mind even slightly. On the third evening after the children were in bed, Abigail told Martha everything: the fever and Thomas's death, Harlan Voss and the papers, the road. And then she told her about the ranch at Harrow Creek and Perry Shepard, and she told it plainly because Martha was the kind of woman you could tell things plainly to. Martha listened without interrupting, which for Martha was a significant act of restraint. When Abigail was finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. "He fixed your wagon in the night," Martha said. "He did, and kept your ox for 2 days at his own expense. He did, and gave the twins a kitten." "Yes." Martha looked at her niece with an expression that contained both fondness and the particular exasperation of someone watching another person be deliberately obtuse. "Abigail," she said. "Do not," Abigail said. "I am simply observing, Martha." Martha picked up her mending and said nothing more for a while, in the manner of a woman who has made her point and is content to let it sit. Abigail lay awake that night in Martha's spare room, listening to the sound of the children sleeping and thinking about a man standing at the end of a lane with his hat in his hands. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself that a man being decent and kind to a woman in need was not the same as what she was turning it into in her head. She told herself that she had 4 children and $11, and that the practical architecture of her life had no room in it for the particular kind of feeling that was apparently attempting to take up residence in her chest. She told herself all of these things, and then she lay in the dark and thought about the morning light on his face and the way he had carried Benny across the dark yard without a word. She was in Laredo 6 weeks. She helped Martha with the boarders, cooking and cleaning and managing the household with the efficiency she had always brought to such things. Martha paid her a small wage, modest but regular, and Abigail saved every cent. Eli enrolled in the small school 3 streets over and came home each day with news of everything he had learned. Clara made 3 best friends in the first week and lost one of them by the 3rd week and gained 2 more. Benny and Rose found that a town had considerably more to explore than a homestead, and Abigail spent a portion of each day retrieving them from wherever they had wandered. It was a life. It was a reasonable life. It was not nothing. She wrote a letter to Perry Shepard. She wrote it, in fact, on a Thursday evening, 4 weeks after arriving in Laredo, and she threw it in the fire, not because it was poorly written, but because she was not sure what she was doing. She wrote another one the following Thursday and threw that one in the fire too. The 3rd Thursday she wrote the letter and sent it before she could think too hard about it. She thanked him properly for what he had done. She told him that Solomon had healed well on the road. She told him that the wagon had been entirely sound all the way to Laredo. She told him that the children were well, and the kitten named Perry had made the journey successfully and had been terrorizing Martha's boarders with great enthusiasm. She told him that Eli had asked about the cattle twice since they arrived, which seemed worth mentioning. And then she said that she hoped he was well, and that the ranch was well, and she signed it Abigail Gentry and sealed it before she could read it again. She did not expect him to write back. She had written because she wanted to, not because she thought it would begin anything. He wrote back in 12 days. His letter was short and written in a clean, even hand. He said he was glad Solomon had healed well and that the wagon had held. He said he was glad the children had settled in Laredo. He said that the orange cat, whose name he had still not settled on, had recently had kittens of her own, which suggested that the kitten named Perry was in good health back at the ranch. He said the fall was dry this year and the cattle were doing well, and the south fence had held after the summer. And at the end of the letter he said that it had been a quieter autumn than usual and that he had noticed it. She read that last sentence 3 times. Then she read the whole letter again. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a while, and Martha, who had walked in from the kitchen, took one look at Abigail's face and one look at the letter, and made herself very busy doing something in the next room. She wrote back the following day. Not the following Thursday, but the following day. She wrote about the children, about Eli's school, about Clara's new friends, about Benny and Rose, and their systematic exploration of Laredo. She wrote about Martha and the boarding house, and what it was like to be in a town again. And at the end she said that she had found herself noticing the way the light came through the windows in the afternoon, and thinking that his spare room had the same kind of light, which was an odd thing to notice, and she was not sure why she was writing it. She sent it before she could second-guess herself. His reply took 10 days this time. It was longer. He wrote about the cattle and the land, but also about the books on his shelf, a particular volume of natural history he had been reading, and about a conversation he had with Dooley about whether the rain was going to come before winter and who had been right, and about the way the hill country looked in October when the cedar had gone that particular dark green, and the sky was the color it only gets in the fall. And he wrote at the end that he was glad she had written, that he had found himself checking for letters with a regularity that was new to him. She read that and sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed carefully. Martha appeared in the doorway, took in the situation, and said, "I am going to make tea," and disappeared again. They wrote to each other every week after that. The letters grew longer. They wrote about everything and nothing, about the children and the cattle and the weather and the books they were reading, and about their lives in the way that people write to each other when they are slowly handing pieces of themselves across the distance. He wrote about his father and the way he had learned ranching. She wrote about Thomas and the early years of their marriage, the good ones, before the debt and the hardship had worn everything thin. She wrote about what she wanted for her children. He wrote about what he had built the ranch to be. In November he wrote and said he was going to Harrow Creek for supplies in the first week of December, and he expected he would pass through on the return trip on the Laredo Road, if it happened that she was walking on the Laredo Road in the first week of December. She sent her reply the next morning. She wrote, "I am generally in the vicinity of the Laredo Road in the mornings." He arrived on a Wednesday, the 4th of December, 1876, which was a cold, clear day with a wind coming down from the north and the cedar smelling sharp and clean. He rode his roan horse down the main road of Laredo at mid-morning, and she was standing on the porch of Martha's boarding house, which was on the main road, and she had not planned to be standing there, but she was. He saw her and slowed his horse and swung down. He looked the same, lean and rope-hardened and direct. But he was wearing a clean shirt and his coat was brushed and his hat was in his hand before he got all the way to the porch, and she thought, not for the first time, that this man was incapable of pretending about what he felt. "Mrs. Gentry," he said. "Mr. Shepard," she said. They stood there on the porch step for a moment, 2 people who had been writing to each other for 6 weeks, and who now had to account for the fact that all of that writing had brought them somewhere. "Come in," she said. "Martha has coffee." Martha had more than coffee. Martha had apparently prepared for a very significant guest because the dining table had 3 kinds of cake on it in addition to coffee, which was the kind of move that Abigail found both touching and extremely unhelpful. Perry sat at the table with his hat on his knee and drank coffee with the focused gratitude of a man who has been riding in November cold for 2 days. And Martha asked him exactly 3 pointed questions about the ranch that were ostensibly practical, but were actually an assessment. And he answered them with the same directness he brought to everything. And Abigail watched Martha decide in the space of about 4 minutes that she approved of Perry Shepard. The children came home from school and errands at noon and found Perry Shepard at the kitchen table, and the reunion was loud and immediate. Eli shook his hand again, with slightly less effort this time to appear older than he was, which meant he was more comfortable. Clara demanded a full report on the cats. Benny and Rose each informed Perry separately and in great detail about everything that had happened since they left the ranch. Perry listened to all of it. He stayed for lunch. He walked with Abigail and the children in the afternoon, down to the river and back, the children ranging ahead and falling behind in the erratic orbit of the young, while Perry and Abigail walked beside each other and talked about the things you talk about when you have been writing letters for 6 weeks and are now standing in the same place, which is everything and nothing because all of it is just a way of being near each other. They walked by the river in the afternoon light and the water was low but still moving and the cottonwoods along the bank had gone gold, late for it but beautiful, and Abigail was looking at the water and Perry was looking at her, and finally she turned and caught him looking and they both went still. "I have something to say," he said. "I thought you might," she said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing it. "I have been thinking clearly for 7 years, and in that time I have not had much reason to say things to anyone that required saying carefully," he said. "I find I am out of practice." "You write very well," she said. "Writing is different," he said. "You can think it through." He paused. "Abigail." He said her name the first time he had used it without the misses, and the sound of it was very different. "I am not a man who makes speeches. I know what I want and I say it, and I have said it to you in the letters and I mean every word of it. But I want to say it out loud here in front of the river because it seems like the kind of thing that ought to be said out loud." She waited. "I would like you to come back to the ranch," he said. "Not to pass through. To stay. To make it your home and bring your children and be there, with me. I know that is a great deal to ask of a woman who has already lost one home and who has every reason to be cautious about what she trusts and who she trusts it to." He was holding his hat and it was very still in his hands. "But I am asking." The river moved past them. The cottonwoods made a sound in the wind like pages turning. "You would need to ask the children," she said, "before you ask me." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I am asking you first, because if your answer is no, there is no point in asking the children." She looked at him with the direct, considering look that he had come to think of as one of the most honest things about her. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first night at his gate, measuring what was there with the unsentimental eye of a woman who had learned that the world did not always reward trust. "My answer is not no," she said. He let out a breath that she thought he had been holding for quite some time. "That is a careful answer," he said. "I am a careful woman," she said. "But careful is not the same as unwilling." She was quiet a moment, looking at the river. "I thought about you the whole road to Laredo," she said. "I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself that a man being kind is not the same as what I was making it in my head." She paused. "But I kept writing the letters." "And you kept writing back, and it was not nothing." "No," he said, "it was not nothing. The children have lost a great deal," she said. "I will not bring them somewhere that will hurt them." "I know that," he said. "I would not ask it." She looked at him. "You are a good man, Perry Shepard," she said, and the way she said it was not a compliment, it was an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge something that you have established as fact after careful consideration. "I try to be," he said, which was what she had said to him, and she heard it, and the small smile that moved across her face was the particular kind that belongs to two people who are beginning to have a private language. They told the children that evening after supper. Perry sat at Martha's table with the 4 of them arranged around him, Eli and Clara across and Benny and Rose on either side, and he told them he had spoken to their mother, and that he would like them all to come back to the ranch to live, if they were agreeable. Eli asked 3 practical questions about horses and cattle and school, in that order, and Perry answered all 3 to Eli's evident satisfaction. Clara said yes immediately and with great feeling. Benny and Rose looked at each other with the private communication of twins, and then Benny said, "Will the cats be there?" And Perry said yes, all of them, including the new kittens, and that was the matter settled as far as Benny and Rose were concerned. Martha hugged Abigail in the kitchen afterward and said approximately nothing useful, but the hug itself communicated everything she needed to say. They left for the Shepard Ranch in the first week of January, 1877. The road back north was cold and clear, the grass winter brown and the sky the pale, clean blue of deep January. Solomon walked well, his tendon fully healed now, and the wagon ran true on its good axle and reset wheels. Perry rode alongside on the roan horse, and the children took turns riding beside him on the old mare, and the trip that had taken Abigail 10 days alone took them 6 days together because they did not have to stop as often, and because there was someone else to spell her on the reins. On the 4th evening they camped by a creek and made a fire and ate hot food, and the children went asleep bundled in quilts in the wagon while Perry and Abigail sat by the fire in the cold, clean dark. The stars over Texas in January are a particular abundance, and they were both quiet for a while looking at them. "Are you afraid?" he said. She considered the question. "Of what?" "Of coming back. Of starting over in a place." She looked at the fire. "I have been afraid for 6 months," she said. "I am not sure that starting over in a place with someone I trust is the thing that frightens me most." She paused. "What frightens me is the children. They have lost one stability already. I need this to be real." "It is real," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am here." He looked at her across the fire. She looked back at him. The fire snapped and sent a small arc of sparks up into the dark. He reached across the distance between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the cold by the fire under the January stars of the Texas Hill Country, and it was entirely enough for that night. They arrived at the Shepard Ranch on a Friday afternoon in the 2nd week of January, and Dooley McCabe was standing in the barn yard when they came up the lane, and he took off his hat and held it the same way Perry held his hat when something was worth marking, and he said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Gentry." And Abigail looked at the barn and the house and the fences and the horses in the pasture and the thin winter sky overhead, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. The children tumbled out of the wagon. Clara found the cats immediately. Rose and Benny ran to find their kitten Perry, who had returned to the ranch with something of a homecoming reception from the other cats. Eli went directly to the stable to see the horses, because he was his mother's son and practical things came first. Perry helped Abigail down from the wagon and she stood in the yard and looked at the house. "It needs curtains," she said. "It does," he agreed. "And something on the floor in the main room." "I always thought it was fine without," he said. "That is because you have never had a rug on the floor," she said. "You do not know what you are missing." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been seeing since December, since the afternoon by the river in Laredo, the one that was unguarded and warm and very sure of itself. "I am beginning to understand that argument," he said. They were married in March, in the small whitewashed church in Harrow Creek, with the 4 children in their best clothes and Dooley standing as Perry's witness and Martha, who had ridden up from Laredo for the occasion, standing as Abigail's. The preacher was a compact, red-faced man named Reverend Bills, who performed the ceremony with both solemnity and what appeared to be considerable personal satisfaction. Perry said his vows looking at Abigail with the same direct, steady gaze he brought to all things, and she said hers looking back at him the same way. And when Reverend Bills pronounced them man and wife, and Perry kissed her in front of the whole church, and the children and Dooley and Martha, and the 20 or so people from Harrow Creek who had turned up because there was not a great deal of entertainment in Harrow Creek in March, Clara burst into enthusiastic and completely unself-conscious applause. And Benny and Rose followed her lead, and even Eli was grinning, that particular grin that lives just below dignity. The reception was at the ranch. Abigail had baked 2 days straight, and so had Martha, and so, improbably, had Dooley, who it turned out made an excellent pie. The tables were set outside in the cold, clear March air, and there was fiddle music because a man named Walter Briggs from Harrow Creek played, and he had been invited primarily for this purpose. and people danced in the yard until after dark while the children ran through the lantern light, and the stars came out one by one over the hills. Perry danced with Abigail 3 times, which was 2 more times than he had ever danced in his life. And he was not a fluid dancer, but he was steady, and he did not let go of her hand between songs, which was better than fluid. She leaned against him at the end of the last dance with her forehead briefly against his shoulder, just one moment, and he put his hand on the back of her head and held her there, and they were still in the middle of the moving party, just the two of them, quiet. Spring came and the ranch came alive with it in the way that the hill country does, the cedar and the bluebonnets and the particular green of new grass. And Abigail planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that grew with a stubbornness matching her own. Perry built a second bedroom onto the house because 4 children needed more space than the spare room, and Eli helped him with the framing in the afternoons and showed a real aptitude for the work that Perry encouraged carefully and steadily. Abigail taught Clara to keep the household accounts because Clara had a head for numbers that was not going to be wasted. Clara took to it with the same ferocious thoroughness she brought to everything, and within 3 months could balance the household ledger better than Perry could, a fact Perry acknowledged without any apparent damage to his pride. Dooley took Eli on as a proper learner of the cattle trade, teaching him the way of the herd and the land with the patience of a man who enjoyed passing things on. By summer, Eli was riding the south pasture alongside Dooley on regular days and had the beginning of the particular posture that belongs to someone who belongs on a horse. The twins were in school in Harrow Creek, 2 days a week, which was what the school offered, and they were both formidably social and had populated their social world with the thorough efficiency that seemed to be native to them. Benny was quieter than his sister but more observant, and Rose was loud enough for both of them and kind enough to compensate for the loudness. There was a woman in Harrow Creek named Mrs. Dalton, a widow of the harsh variety, who made it her business to comment on other people's domestic arrangements. She said to her neighbor and to anyone within earshot who would engage with it, that it was a peculiar thing for a man of Perry Shepard's standing to take on a widow with 4 children not his own and give them his name, that there was surely more behind it than met the eye. Perry heard about this through Dooley, which was how most things went through Harrow Creek. Perry's response was to invite the Dalton woman and her husband to supper the following Saturday, a move that appeared to confuse everyone including Dooley. At supper Perry was the same as he always was, direct and decent and quietly certain of himself, and Abigail was herself, which is to say she was warm and capable, and ran her household with an ease that made it look effortless and was anything but. And the 4 children were exactly themselves, loud and curious and well-mannered, and happy in the way of children who are being raised by people who have thought carefully about the matter. Mr. Dalton enjoyed himself thoroughly. Mrs. Dalton ate 3 helpings of the apple cake and said on the way home that Abigail Gentry, or Abigail Shepard she supposed, was a remarkably competent woman, and that the children were very well behaved. This was not an apology, but it was the closest Mrs. Dalton had come to one in a long time, and Harrow Creek gave her credit for it. In the late summer of 1877, Abigail knew she was expecting. She told Perry on a Tuesday evening when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and the late summer night was coming through the open window with the smell of dried grass and the cedar. Perry was reading at the table, and he looked up when she said it and put the book down very carefully, with the precise deliberateness of a man who is managing his expression while his insides are doing something considerably less composed. "Are you well?" he said, the first thing. "I am perfectly well," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up from the table and walked to her and put both his hands on her face the way Martha had at the Laredo boarding house, just holding it, looking at her. And she put her hands over his hands, and they stood there in the kitchen in the late summer dark, and something about the moment was so full of everything they had built, and everything that was coming that neither of them said anything else for a while. The baby was born in March 1878, exactly 1 year after their wedding, which Perry noted with the air of a man who finds the symmetry entirely satisfying. It was a boy, broad and healthy and loud about his opinions from the first hour, and Perry held him in the barn light. The birth had been in the house, but Perry had taken the baby to the barn for one moment alone with him, while the midwife and Abigail's cousin Martha, who had come up again for the occasion, were busy. And he stood in the barn where all of it had started, in the place he had built the spring before the autumn she arrived. And he held his son, and the lantern made its warm circle around them both. They named him Thomas, for Abigail's first husband, because Perry had suggested it and she had looked at him for a long moment and then said yes. He was Thomas James Shepard, Thomas for the man who had given her 4 good children and who deserved to have something carry his name forward, and James for Perry's own father. Eli, who was 10 now and had grown 3 inches in the year on the ranch, was the first of the siblings to hold his new brother, and he did it with a gravity that made Perry want to sit down somewhere quiet. It moved him so. Clara held the baby and announced that he was very red and seemed cross, which was accurate, and that she expected he would improve. Benny and Rose inspected him at the same time from opposite sides of the bed, and Rose declared that he was the best thing that had happened since the kittens, which was meant as high praise. Life on the Shepard Ranch grew with the years in the way that a well-tended thing grows, not in dramatic leaps, but in the steady layering of a life being built right. The cattle operation expanded through the late 1870s as Perry and Dooley, and then Eli managed the herd with the consistent care that produced consistent results. The house had curtains now, Abigail's own work, and a braided rug in the main room that she and Clara had made together over the course of a winter. The kitchen garden had become something impressive by the second year, and Abigail had taken to drying and preserving on a scale that filled the cellar every fall. In 1879 there was another pregnancy, and Abigail told Perry in the same way she had told him the first time, in the evening with the house quiet, and he responded in the same way, the careful deliberateness that was the surface of something much less contained. This time it was a girl. Perry held her in the barn again, alone for a moment, just the two of them in the lantern circle, and he talked to her the way he talked to his cattle and his horses, low and steady, telling her about the land and the sky and the rain. They named her Margaret, after Perry's mother. Between little Thomas and Margaret and the 4 older children, the house that had been too quiet for too long was now, by any measure, a lively place. Abigail ran it with the efficiency she had always brought to everything, and with a fullness she had not entirely anticipated, because there is a difference between managing a household out of necessity and managing it out of love, and she had been doing the former for long enough to know what the latter felt like. Clara turned 14 and was the most useful person in the house behind her mother, practical and organized and good with the little ones, in a way that was not just help but genuine affection. Eli at 13 was more ranch hand than child by any practical measure, working alongside Perry with the focused competence of someone who has found his place and knows it. The twins were 11 and had evolved into individuals as distinct from each other as 2 people could be, while still being entirely inseparable. There was a difficulty in the spring of 1880 when Harlan Voss, whose reach had continued to extend along the river road, sent 2 men to Perry with a proposal to purchase the south pasture grazing rights. Perry declined. The men came back a week later with a different tone and a suggestion that it would be in Perry's interest to reconsider. Perry told them that his interest was to be left alone on his own land, and that if they came back a 3rd time, they should expect to have the conversation at the sheriff's office in Harrow Creek. They did not come back a 3rd time. Abigail knew about this because Perry told her that evening, plainly and without drama, the way he told her everything. She sat with it for a moment, the familiar name and the familiar shape of the thing. "He is patient," she said. "So am I," Perry said. She looked at him. "Be more than patient," she said. "Be documented. Keep every record of every transaction and every land boundary in a fireproof box. What he did to me, he did through paperwork. The answer to that is better paperwork." Perry looked at her with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when she had said something that reorganized his thinking. "That is a very good point," he said. "I have met Harlan Voss," she said. "In a manner of speaking." She paused. "I made the mistake of not understanding what I was signing." "You will not make that mistake because you are not the kind of man who signs what he does not understand. But he will look for the gap. Don't leave one." Perry got a fireproof box. He kept meticulous records. He had a lawyer in Harrow Creek review his land documents that spring and found, in fact, one clause in an old water rights agreement that was ambiguous and had it corrected by a proper legal instrument. Harlan Voss made no further move against the Shepard ranch. Whether this was because of the records or because Voss had turned his attention to easier targets, neither Perry nor Abigail could say for certain. What they knew was that their land was sound and documented and beyond contention, and that was enough. Dooley McCabe, who had been a confirmed bachelor for 42 years when Abigail arrived on the ranch, fell entirely and completely in love with a woman named Priscilla Hayward who arrived in Harrow Creek in 1880 as the new schoolteacher. Priscilla was 30, sharp and dark-haired and completely unmoved by the general male population of Harrow Creek in a way that she found practical and they found bewildering. She found Dooley, specifically, not bewildering, and this finding was mutual and rapid and slightly startling to Dooley himself. It was Abigail who realized what was happening before Dooley did, and it was Abigail who gently and without appearing to do anything in particular, made sure that Priscilla was invited to the ranch for supper at regular intervals, and who arranged for Dooley to be present at those suppers, and who absolutely did not mention any of this to anyone, including Perry, until after Dooley had proposed and Priscilla had accepted. Perry, when told, looked at his wife with a look of pure admiring exasperation. "You arranged that," he said. "I facilitated a natural development," she said. "You arranged it," he said. "They are both happy, Perry." "They are extremely happy," he said. "I am not disputing that. I am disputing the framing." She smiled at him in the particular way she had developed for exactly this kind of moment, which was the smile of a woman who is right and knows it and does not need to argue the point. Dooley and Priscilla were married in the fall of 1880 and built a small house on the east edge of the Shepard land, which Perry offered and they accepted. And Priscilla continued to teach at the school in Harrow Creek, and Dooley continued his work on the ranch, and they were both deeply pleased with the arrangement. Clara at 16 enrolled in the same school where Priscilla taught, and showed an aptitude for learning that even Clara's own formidable self-assessment had not fully predicted. Priscilla told Abigail privately that Clara had the best mathematical mind she had encountered in years of teaching, and that if the girl was given the education, she could do real work with it. Abigail listened to this and thought about it carefully, and began making practical calculations about what an education for Clara might require and how to achieve it. Eli at 15 was unmistakably Perry's son in everything but blood. He worked the cattle and the land with Perry's steadiness and Perry's judgment, and had Perry's way of being direct and unhurried in everything he said and did. He called Perry by his first name still, not father, which was the arrangement they had landed on when they arrived and which suited both of them, but there was no question, watching them work together, of what they were to each other. Perry had never tried to replace Thomas Gentry in the children's memory or affection. What he had done instead was be consistently and completely present, which was, as Eli told his mother once with the directness of his 14-year-old self, better. In the summer of 1880, Abigail and Perry rode out alone one evening, which was a thing they did when the practical logistics of the household allowed it, which was not as often as either of them would have liked, and which they treated accordingly when it happened. They rode south to the top of the ridge that looked over the whole of the lower ranch and the river beyond it, and they let the horses stand and looked at the land in the late evening light, the summer brown grass and the dark cedar, and the particular gold the light makes of everything it touches in the last hour before dark in Texas. "I think about that first night sometimes," Perry said. "When I arrived at your gate," she said. "When you arrived at my gate with 1 ox and 4 children and a cracked wagon axle," he said, "and told me plainly what you needed and asked for nothing more than what was reasonable." "I was terrified," she said. He looked at her. "You did not appear terrified." "That is because I had 4 children behind me and I could not appear terrified," she said. "I was holding on with both hands." He looked at her for a moment with the full attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel both seen and certain. "I knew before you left," he said. "When you drove away that morning, I knew I was going to write to you." "You took long enough about it," she said. "I waited for you to write first," he said. "You waited to see if I would," she said, "because you do not ask twice for important things." He was quiet for a moment. "That is what you said on the road about Florence." "Yes. You were right," he said. "It was too proud." He looked at the land. "I think what I was afraid of was what I felt the night you arrived. It was," he paused, selecting the word with his usual care. "It was too much for one evening." She understood. She had felt the same thing, which was why she had not looked back when she drove away, because looking back would have meant reckoning with it in the open road with 4 children aboard and 200 miles to go. "I looked back," Eli said later, when she told this story to the family one evening when the children were old enough for it. Eli was 23 by then, fully himself, settled and capable and working the ranch that was already beginning to be his as much as Perry's. "I watched Perry standing at the end of the lane with his hat in his hand. I did not say anything to Mama for 3 days. "Why not?" Clara said. "Because she was not ready to hear it yet," Eli said, with the simple accuracy of someone who had been watching carefully since he was 9 years old. Perry looked at Eli across the table with the look he had been giving that boy since he was 9 years old, walking quietly beside his tired mother in the dark. The look that said he was proud of him in a way that went entirely past words. In the fall of 1882, Clara went to San Antonio. It was Priscilla who had written the letters, with Abigail's knowledge and Perry's quiet support, to a ladies' academy there that had a mathematics and natural science program, and Clara had been accepted on the strength of work samples Priscilla had submitted. Abigail went to San Antonio with her, traveled down and settled her in and saw the school and met the headmistress and stood on the San Antonio street outside the academy afterward and breathed carefully. Perry had come too. He stood beside her on that street and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Clara was going to be fine, better than fine. Clara was going to be magnificent, but the going was still the going. He put his arm around Abigail's shoulders on that street and she leaned against him, and they stood there a moment in the middle of San Antonio while the city moved around them. "She is going to fill every room she is ever in," Abigail said. "She always has," Perry said. That was entirely true, and it was enough. The years moved forward in the way of good years, with their accumulations and their ordinary griefs and their steady, unremarkable gifts. Young Thomas Shepard grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated boy who had his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness, and was generally considered by everyone on the ranch to be an event rather than a person. Margaret was quieter, studious and gentle in a way that combined her parents' best qualities in a form neither of them had entirely anticipated. When Margaret was 7, she decided she wanted to learn to read before she started school and taught herself from her siblings' old primers in the space of a summer, which surprised everyone except Abigail, who had been watching and was not surprised at all. Benny grew into a man with an aptitude for mechanical things, for the craft of fixing and building, and by the time he was 17, he was the person everyone on the ranch, and in Harrow Creek brought things to when things needed repairing. Rose grew into a woman of such forthright social confidence that even Mrs. Dalton, who was still alive and still opinionated in Harrow Creek, found her charming and said so publicly, which was noted as a remarkable social achievement in several households. Eli married at 25, a rancher's daughter named Helen from Hayes County, a quiet and capable woman who arrived at the Shepard Ranch for the first time and looked around with assessing eyes, not unlike those of a woman who had once arrived at this same gate at dusk, and who clearly liked what she saw. They built a small house on the north section of the ranch and began building their own life there, which was exactly as it should be. Clara came home from San Antonio with a mathematics certificate, and then went back for more study, and then came home again at 22 as someone who had changed the room she was in from the first word she spoke, which was exactly what Priscilla had predicted and what Abigail had always known. She taught at the Harrow Creek School for 2 years and then was offered a position at a girls' school in Austin that Priscilla helped her pursue and which she accepted and which took her there. And Abigail sent her off with the same steady composure she brought to all necessary things, and then sat on the porch that evening and Perry sat with her and the night was soft and full of stars and neither of them needed to say much. "She will be all right," Perry said. "I know," Abigail said. "She is Clara." "Yes," he said. "She is Clara." That covered the matter entirely. On a Thursday evening in October 1885, which was a cool, clear evening with the cedar sharp on the air, and the cattle quiet in the south pasture, and the last of the autumn light spreading itself thin and beautiful across the hills, Perry Shepard and Abigail Shepard sat on their porch in the 2 chairs they had placed there years ago, one on each side, close enough to speak without raising their voices. The house behind them had lamplight in 2 windows, and the sound of Thomas and Margaret arguing about something at the table, which had a familiar rhythm to it. Little Thomas was 7, and Margaret was 6, and they argued about everything with the energy of people who have not yet realized that they agree on more than they dispute. This would become apparent to them in time, for now the argument was lively, and concerned a particular book that they both wanted and which, by Abigail's design, they could only access by sitting down together, which was not a natural arrangement for them, but was one they had arrived at on this particular evening. Perry had a cup of coffee. Abigail had a cup of tea. The porch had 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them that Perry had made the winter before from a cedar he had taken down after the big winter storm. Dooley and Priscilla's lamp was visible at the east edge of the property, steady and warm. "Do you remember," Abigail said, "what you said to me that first night about Solomon's tendon? That it needed rest and cold poultices and grain, not in that order," Perry said. "Yes," she said. "I thought then that you were a man who had his priorities in the right arrangement." He looked at her sideways, the particular look she had catalogued over the years, the one that was warmth and steadiness and something under both that had never changed. "That is a high compliment for a man who had just told you where to put your ox," he said. "It was a high compliment," she said. "I did not give it lightly." He reached across the small cedar table and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his, the way they held hands on that first night by the fire on the road, easy and settled. The October evening came in around them, carrying all its fine, cold sweetness. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. Dooley's lamp glowed at the edge of the world. Inside the house, Thomas and Margaret had apparently reached an accommodation because the arguing had settled into the particular focused silence of 2 children looking at the same book. Eli and Helen were 3 miles north on their own land, building what they were building. Clara was in Austin being magnificent, as scheduled. Benny was in Harrow Creek with his tools and his gifts. Rose was wherever Rose was in any given moment, which was always somewhere interesting. The Shepard Ranch sat solid and well-loved in the October dark, every fence sound, every roof good, every beam and post and window and door the product of work done carefully and with intention, and the land around it lay quiet and faithful, land that had been bought and built and defended and tended, and that knew who it belonged to. Perry Shepard held his wife's hand on the porch of the house they had made together, in the last of the October light, and she held his hand back, and between them there was the entire accumulated weight of a life. Of a morning he had lit a forge before dawn because a woman with 4 children and 1 lame ox and a cracked wagon axle had arrived at his gate at dusk, and he had known, without quite knowing that he knew it, that she was someone worth staying up for. "Perry," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I arrived at your gate," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, the thinking quiet, not the empty quiet but the one that meant he was choosing. "I had the barn ready," he said. She laughed, that full real laugh that he had been collecting for 9 years, the sound of it as good as it had ever been. "You had the barn ready before you met me," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I think maybe I built it for you." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the last of the October sky. Then she looked at him, straight on, the same way she had looked at him that first night at the gate, with the same directness and the same full weight of her real self behind it. "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He considered this. "That is a low bar." "It is an appropriate bar," she said, "for a man who spent our first evening talking to me about ox tendons." "That ox tendon was relevant," he said. "It absolutely was," she agreed. The October dark came in gently and completely, and the porch lamp made its warm circle and they sat in it, the 2 of them, easy and settled and entirely sure. And the night moved around them like the river moves around a stone that has been there long enough to belong to the water. And inside the house, the children's voices rose and fell with the ordinary music of a life being lived well. And it was all of it, every particular piece of it, exactly enough.